start. It is right about 1:30, and I want to make sure that you all have every opportunity to take advantage of the panelists by my sides here, because you've got a powerhouse team at the tables right here. So it is my job to make sure that we have the conversation that you all want to have as audience members. My name is Stacy Armijo, and I am Senior Vice President of Pierpont Communications, and I am your moderator today. So I've had the opportunity to talk with our panelists to scope our conversation. So I'd like to just take a moment to introduce you to the folks who are going to be providing you some insights today on a network of networks. And since she tried to escape to the side of the table, I'm going to make her go first. First is Jane Park. So Jane is Vice President of Regulatory Policy and Strategy at ComEd, which is the largest electric utility in Illinois, serving 3.8 million customers, or 70% of the state of Illinois. And just 3 months ago, she was Director of Business Strategy and Technology at ComEd, responsible for, among many other things, customer operations, technology enhancements, and innovative product development. So she brings a very real-world, hands-on perspective to the topic that we're going to be talking about today, how to practically deliver the promises of the smart grid to consumers, and balancing that, of course, with the interests of things like safety, reliability, service, and how to adapt policy to get there. And I asked each of our panelists for a fun fact, and Jane's fun fact was that she has gotten to hug Muhammad Ali, which I was pretty impressed with. Please welcome Jane. And to Jane's right is Claire Butterfield. Left, thank you very much. Right, left. You're right. Is Claire Butterfield, Program Director for the Illinois Science and Energy Innovation Foundation, or ISIF, whose mission is to empower consumers to take advantage of smart grid programs and create positive changes in consumer behavior related to energy use. So we're getting to the consumer side of what we're talking about when it comes to smart grid. To give you a little background on ISIF, it was created through a $50 million investment by Ameren and ComEd in 2011 to fund the most promising initiatives to educate consumers about smart grid opportunities as part of one of the largest and most comprehensive statewide grid modernization efforts in history. So a very big project. In Claire's role, she originated and now she manages the grants function for the organization. So she utilizes relationships that she developed over 14 years in her prior role as Executive Director of Faith in Place, which is an organization that inspires religious people of diverse faith to care for the earth through education, connection, and advocacy. And this fun fact might not surprise you after learning that. She's an ordained minister. So please welcome Claire. To Claire's left is Nathan Shannon. Nathan is the Deputy Director of Smart Grid Consumer Collaborative in Atlanta, Georgia, whose mission is to advance a consumer-friendly, consumer-safe smart grid through research, education, and collaboration. So SGCC, as the acronym is known, is a membership organization. It's made up of commercial, utility, and advocacy organizations who want to collaborate together on smart grid initiatives and access the organization's research on consumer preferences and best practices. Nathan is responsible for cultivating membership, and he presents SGCC research at conferences and through blogs and essays. And his fun fact is that he was a competitive water skier. So please welcome Nathan. To my left is Ravi Pradhan. Did I pronounce that right? Pradhan. He is Vice President of Technology Strategy for Siemens Digital Grid Division Software and Solutions in Minneapolis, and is responsible for selecting and implementing the appropriate technologies for Siemens Digital Grid Software Solutions. Ravi was the executive technical lead for the PJAC2 project that implemented a groundbreaking dual primary control center for managing the bulk of the northeastern U.S.'s transmission grid. And I am not a techie, so I'm going to read this last part because I think it's really important to all of you who understand more about technical aspects than I do. Prior to that, he was the principal architect for the California ISO Market Redesign and Technology Update project. So that included a large IT integration component along with market optimization software. And he's also been the lead on EMS projects in Mexico City, in Johannesburg, South Africa, NSP in Minneapolis, and Hydro-Quebec in Montreal. And given the global nature of his work, it may not surprise you that he actually got to attend Nelson Mandela's inauguration. So welcome to Ravi. And all the way down on the left is Brewster McCracken. Brewster is president and CEO of Pecan Street, which is a research commercialization institute focused on utilities and headquartered at the University of Texas here in Austin. Pecan Street operates at the intersection between ideas and adoption, serving as a testing ground for utilities innovations and a touchstone for researchers' applications to create energy-efficient technologies and practices that consumers will actually adopt. So Brewster himself has a background that blends theory and practice. He spearheaded the creation of incubators at UT, at the University of Texas, in bioscience and wireless technologies, and he served 2 terms on the Austin City Council, serving as a board member of Austin Energy in that capacity as well. And his fun fact is that he got to sit next to Richard Linklater at a screening of Dazed and Confused and hear all the backstories to that great movie. You'll have to ask him about that at cocktails. Welcome, Brewster. Okay, so we're going to jump in, and right on cue is my reminder to mention the music you might be hearing. Some lovely whistles that are part of an art exhibit, apparently by Devo, one of the artists from Devo. We're pretty excited about that here in our arts culture in Austin. It's going to go off frequently, so we hope it goes on at the most opportune moments where we're making very salient points. But I hope you will forgive any distraction that might cause for you in our great conversation. So let's get started. As we approach this topic of the network of networks, there's been a lot of conversation about things related to technical aspects of it and things related to consumer aspects of the network of networks. And I think we're probably going to focus most on the second part of that conversation, which is what role does the consumer play in this? What does the consumer want? Where is the demand? And how can organizations practically center around that? And so I've asked Brewster to start for us, just based on the work that Pecan Street does with relation to working with researchers to know what technology is available, and then the commercialization path of that. What's most popular, what's not as popular? Start us off with a little bit of stage setting, if you would.
So for those of us you don't know what we've been doing for the last 6-7 years, we've been carrying out the operation of the largest residential test bed, research test bed on how people use electricity, gas, water, and appliances anywhere in the world. So we manage the 3rd most electric use data in the state of Texas after Encore and CenterPoint. So we're managing a lot of data. We're using it to do measurement and verification of what people do and how they respond to stuff. So where we are in terms of what people have access to in a typical smart grid is kind of similar right now in terms of its utility to customers to what the old dial-up modems were, which is not, there are some useful things that could come out of it. But remember, before the iPod didn't come out until broadband adoption was starting to get wide, because Apple's insight was it would take you, half a day to download a song. I mean, you weren't going to download a song, right? And when until broadband came along, the ability to manage that kind of data to provide the things consumers wanted and fast enough was a very important intersection. So what we're seeing happening on the side of how data and new systems coming in people's homes is we're kind of in that dial-up modem stage with smart meters, but there's some interesting currents going on at the moment around the increasing interest in batteries. And batteries connected with gas generators and solar panels and things like that, because by necessity, what's going to emerge, it appears very plausible, is that there will be a big expansion of data collection capabilities from the devices that are installed along with batteries. And that opens up a kind of a new vista of things like using data to detect things like if you have a maintenance problem with your air conditioner, or some very fine-grained appliance level control for backup power management after a hurricane or something like that. So the era of big data appears poised with the arrival of potentially of batteries to start having something similar to when we went from dial-up to broadband.
Thanks, Brewster. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Nathan first for our next conversation, because I know SGCC has a lot of research related to consumer preferences on where there's the most interest and what we should be doing if we want consumers to have appetite for the types of innovations that Brewster's talking about. So you want to give us some perspective on that? Yeah,
SGCC does nationwide data or nationwide research on what consumers are looking to gain from grid modernization and from AMI-enabled programs. So we talk to consumers about pricing programs that they're interested in, technologies that they have interest in, and kind of gauge how to communicate with them. So we also help our members with communication to customers and creating custom messaging in that area. So a lot of the benefit that we see is looking back at benchmark data to see how consumers have changed in the past few years. We've seen a lot of change in consumers in areas around early adoption. Consumers are really interested in adopting technologies much earlier than they used to be. They're a lot more comfortable doing that. They're a lot more comfortable testing the beta versions and being on the front end. And so I believe it's like 35 to 40% of consumers say that they're willing to adopt technologies early on. And so part of that is helping utilities partner with these technology companies to offer these programs and services to the consumers and kind of creating the messaging around that. So there has been a lot of movement in the industry recently, and so we're just trying to follow that and keep up with where consumers are heading and what they want to see next. And one of the things that you mentioned was storage, battery storage. We're gauging interest from consumers in battery storage, and that is growing a lot in the last 5 years. It was something that 85 to 90% of the population had no idea what was even happening or even that was even an option. Now it's somewhere around 30% have an interest in adopting that technology. So seeing a lot of change.
Okay, so when we talk about consumers, I know we sometimes like to talk about them as one body of consumers, but we know that's not the case. And Claire, I know that you've had a lot of research on different market segments. And as we think about the consumers we should be targeting with these kinds of initiatives, your perspective on how we should think about that.
So ISIP has a particular charge under the legislation that created us that we do 30% of our grant making to ensure that low income and low income seniors get to participate in this technology change. And we treat that as a floor because that is the segment of the market that the market itself isn't going to rush in to address first. And we're finding that there are some applications that really are useful for both those segments, but they may not be for the reasons that a lot of the consumer-facing technology describes as advantageous. So we are doing some research in public housing authority senior buildings around the state of Illinois and finding that seniors are actually willing to engage in their energy use and reduce it to a substantial degree. And it's really, it seems, out of a feeling of social relevance. Because they don't benefit financially from their reduction in use. They're subsidized customers. And on the low-income side, we're looking at a project where the smart meter data is used to allow the creation of a flexible payment product that will allow them to pay as they go, which is only meaningful if you know how far you've gone for that part of the month. And the nonprofit organization that's working on that is trying to wrap the LIHEAP benefits into that. So you don't have to wait till you're 6 months behind and get a $300 bailout. You could tap $20 today and stay current. And the goal there, again, is not necessarily energy reduction. It's the alleviation of 6 months of anxiety for a low-income household.
Makes sense. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of those segments. And Jane, I might ask you to talk about a project I read about on one of the neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago that it sounds like that ComEd is doing some interesting things. But before we get that far into it, wanted to step back just a little bit and take what we've talked about so far, which is a little bit of theory and shaping. And I know at ComEd you're responsible for delivering that at the ground floor level. So if you want to talk a little bit about what the opportunities are in doing that, and then how you manage around some of the risks.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say welcome. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel. I do need to spend one of my minutes explaining the Muhammad Ali story. I can't let that go. About 20 years ago, I had an opportunity to meet him. For the record, I did go in with all intents to just shake the man's hand, and I was going to say, "It's such an honor to meet you, sir." To this day, I don't know how I ended up with my head on his chest and my hands just sort of resting there, thinking how comfortable Muhammad Ali's chest was. But 20 years later, it will always be a highlight. I'm a huge fan of that man and much of what he's accomplished. But moving to the energy sector, I think folks here have heard a lot about what Ann Pramaggiore, our CEO, has talked about in terms of a network theory. For us, especially in terms of asking us how are we creating things internally within ComEd, that's pretty significant. You've heard her talk about how for most of time we had a very supply chain model, customer all the way over there on one end, we're over here, and it's just a series of steps. Thanks to us starting to recognize that our business is comprised of not just one network, but 3 networks, physical, digital, and social. So now it has that 3D element, and also we're starting to realize it's not a line, but if you turn it on its side, it becomes a platform. We've got a whole new way of thinking about how we invest within ComEd. Before, we used to think we've got one nail. It's the physical infrastructure. Let's get all the engineers to build and hammer that nail. And now what we have is a series of 3 networks so that within ComEd, from both not only a theoretical level, but a concrete investment level, we're trying to devote resources to say, don't just build out the physical, build out the digital network. What will it take for us to build out the social network? So what that's meant internally within ComEd is we have very tactical programs that are methodically and strategically going forward to build each of these networks. We force teams to become very cross-functional. So when you referenced Community of the Future and what we're building in Bronzeville, which is a neighborhood in Chicago, 50 years ago, that probably would have just been, hypothetically, a microgrid engineering project. Now, under Anne's leadership and realizing that we have multiple networks, we're forcing the customer operations, the community relations, the low-income revenue management, and all of those people to be part of that team, energy efficiency, so that we can have cross-functional groups that create these solutions. We can talk about what some of those solutions are a little later if you want some concrete examples of what we're building. But I will tell you that for us, the holy grail is not just the fact of 3 networks, but how do you tether the 3 networks together? And it is a rare project that can do that can create that line between the physical build of the DER integration to the digital and riding that network, and then making sure that the customers on their end have like an easy button that they can hit and that it all becomes very tangible to them. There are not a lot of projects where we are really trying to, where we, I think, have really hit that mark, but it is absolutely a business imperative for us to try to do it. So I'll hand it back to you, Stacy.
Perfect. Well, and you made a perfect segue to Ravi, but you mentioned starting with transitioning from this idea of supply chain model and the consumer being at the end. And I know we had some conversation about thinking differently about your consumer, not just as a consumer, but as a part of the process. If you want to talk to that.
As you know, for us and for what we do, we supply tools for utilities, energy retailers to manage better what's out there. And what's out there has changed, as everybody knows, with the advent of all this solar and places like England, wind, and other distributed energy resources, and the capability to really manage load and demand response, right? So that whole flow having changed, as it's become a cliched picture that everybody shows now, right? It was one way, now it's multi-way. What we'd like to think that we can bring to the table, and I think it's something that we're seeing across the world now, I was just in the UK last week actually talking about this, is that there are more than just the technology-driven imperatives for managing or for providing the capability to manage this huge profusion of DERs, right? And the mechanism that we'd like to think about employing more of or encouraging more of is really market mechanisms. So as Stacy brought up early on, one of my projects that really I cut my teeth on and I feel very strongly about was actually some of the market design work and, the implementation of the market in California ISO, right? Which is, whenever I mention it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because some people love it and some people don't. But it's certainly driven very much by market design and the physics of the market. And the question that we'd like to try and address and advocate for is use those same market mechanisms down at the distribution level, down at the distribution grid, and make it so that consumers can access it, right? So that consumers can participate in how they use and manage their energy consumption. One thing that I compare it to is you've got the aggregators who are going to bundle up all this resource and put it on the market or use it in some way. But you've also got consumers who will make use of the energy portals, et cetera, to be able to manage their energy usage on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it's a little bit weak, but the analogy I use is the day trader versus the people who dump everything in the mutual fund, right? There are people and there are mechanisms now to allow consumers to manage their energy. And that's really where we'd certainly like to push it by using market mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So as we think about sort of the environment at large, I think also stepping back a little bit and talking from a policy perspective about, we're talking about a lot of innovation here and we aren't yet ready from a policy perspective to navigate that. So how do you expect that to evolve? And I'll ask Jane because she just got promoted about 3 months ago to a policy role as well to address that for us.
Well, It's a great question, and it's so interesting because people, without the great intro from Stacy, will be like, well, what in the world is a regulatory person doing sitting at the panel on connecting customers to a digital grid? But I will say that in Illinois, for me, this is not a heavy stretch. The work that we're doing on the customer side and the product development side is so customer-centric. It is a different way of thinking about what we're building, not grid-centric, customer-centric. When you step across the threshold into the regulatory sphere, this is the dialogue that most of the regulatory and policymakers are wondering about, right? We have in Illinois, for example, a massive investment in smart meters and the smart grid. We have 2 million of 4 million that are already in the ground. So for us, a digital network is not a piece of theory, it's concrete reality. And so the question for Illinois becomes, how do we maximize the investment that Illinois citizens and ratepayers and consumers have put in so that we're not leaving value on the table? This conversation about doing that maximization of value in a way that is meaningful to customers, not just in one class, but all classes, so the question of affordability is part of it. That is very easily a central part of the regulatory conversation. I will say within Illinois, one of the challenges that I think we're meeting, and maybe all regulatory areas have some of this in various states, is how do you take this conversation here at ETS that is happening, where people understand what a future vision might be, where people start to understand that there are different questions and problems that are posed when your business model changes from a pipe to a platform. And how do you start having that conversation with your regulators, with consumer interest groups like CUB and others for us in Illinois, with stakeholders? That's something where in the policy realm for Illinois, we have our commissioners in our Illinois Commerce Commission trying to take a leading role here. So for example, folks here might be familiar with New York Rev, and Minnesota has the E21 process. Our chairman, Brian Sheehan in Illinois, has indicated that Illinois will be starting a series of policy forums focused on utility of the future that will probably be roughly about 18 months or so. And that's an effort to get most of the stakeholders within Illinois, folks like Claire, folks like the utilities, folks like the Citizens Utility Board and other entities, to come together and have this question about what does it mean to maximize an investment in smart grid? What does it mean to have all this potential? How do you increase transactions? How do you increase DER interaction, distributed energy resources on the grid? And along the way, we have different stakeholders creating policy sessions on smart cities, asking questions about cloud computing, asking questions about cybersecurity. So these are topics that I feel very proud that in Illinois we have both the regulatory policy and consumer stakeholder group that are willing to have this conversation with the utility. I don't think that's true everywhere, but I think it's a foundational step if we want to make everything we talk about here real. We have to start having these conversations with all of the stakeholders in our states.
Well, and I know we've got perspectives from all over the country. If you guys have comments or thoughts on that, about where that's working well or where it might not be, what we can do to foster that thinking. Any perspectives on that? Claire, I noticed you were nodding a lot. Do you have a thought on that?
I don't have a perspective from all over the country because I'm part of that stakeholder group, but I have been part of that stakeholder group in both iterations of my career, and it has been going on for a long time, that conversation. And I like to say now that it's approaching candid, which is probably as close as it's ever going to get, because you have the enviro groups and they have a very definite agenda, and you have the utility that needs what it needs to not go out of business. But they are very professional, courteous, thoughtful conversations, and they've come a long way since they started.
Yeah. And that happens through education. Mm-hmm. And I know part of this whole conversation today is about connecting customers to the digital grid. Mm-hmm. And I love to talk about all the digital projects, and I'm sure Ravi has as well. And you could technologize all of this, but I always give the Claire Butterfields of the world a special shout out, because sometimes it's just that good old-fashioned roll up your sleeves, elbow grease, customer outreach, customer education, going into the neighborhoods, working with the local not-for-profits that's actually going to drive awareness. And I give kudos to ISEF and the organizations that they work with. They work to create seed money for startups that have great ideas and academic institutions that it's very hard to get for them to get oxygen otherwise. So that's an important role. And Claire, if you'd like to add on to my compliments of your group, feel free.
Thank you. I'll just pass them on to the grantees who actually do all the legwork.
Wonderful work.
There you go. So speaking about customer outreach, and Ravi, you mentioned market mechanisms. So I know if you're thinking from the utility perspective, smart grid is an investment. So how do you decide what your ROI is related to smart grid? So one of the questions I'd like to explore a little bit is what does good look like when it comes to participation in smart grid programs? I know one thing that it seems like if I'm an executive within a utility, for example, if I'm not seeing very high penetration rates in some of these programs, do I consider that not a success? How do you advise utilities to judge the success of their smart grid programs? That's to anybody on the panel that cares to address it. Brewster?
Well, I mean, you're faced with the challenge that people don't care about this stuff, right? I mean, they don't. You're taking a system that works extremely well and you're asking people to start trying to focus on the nuts and bolts, operations of something that just works. And most people do not want to do that for very long. That is not an indictment on smart grid. Smart grid has a lot of independent value that stands on its own two legs. And you make your distribution system work more effectively through better technology. That is a good thing. Just don't expect 80 million people to act with a predictable high level of engagement that it's not going to happen, right? I mean, some do, fewer do after 30 days. So there are a couple of pathways, I think, where this produces consumer value. One is the model of what happened with the car companies. So, I mean, if any of you have had OnStar or anything like that, very few people sit there and look at their OnStar app. But there is no doubt about it that the introduction of technologies within cars has made them work much better. And it has made the car life longer, better value for customers. They get immediate feedback if they have a tire that needs more air, which improves fuel economy, right? So better technology has not required high levels of customer engagement. It has actually become an extension of the brain so that people don't have to think about these things. And I think that is probably going to be a better way to think about a successful model for smart grid, is letting that technology do the work for the customers. And by the way, so demand response is an example of that. Demand response leverages the fact that people don't want to become engaged, so that if there's a call to change the thermostat, they know that a predictably high percentage of people won't go change that thermostat setting. It achieves success because customers don't typically want to interact with technology. So I think that car model of using the technology for the benefit of customers, but doing it in a way that doesn't require them to be the one to program the VCR clock, right, which they won't do on a high level on a sustained basis, but instead provides the alerts when the tire is low like a car, or makes everything work better, but just does it for the customers because it's hard to get them to do it themselves.
And am I remembering from some SGCC research recently about some perceptions of consumers valuing the things the smart grid delivers without even knowing that it was the smart grid that was delivering it?
Yeah.
Am I remembering that right?
Yeah.
If you want to expand on it?
I mean, it's true. Well, I agree with what you're saying, Brewster. It's more about education on the benefits than it is actually engaging them around them, because they only want engaged to a point. So, like you said, demand response, easy way to get some initial education to the customer, and then they can just set it and forget it. But yeah, we have found that consumers do place an economic value, an environmental value, and a reliability value to smart grid infrastructure improvements. So we have done a lot of research around where those benefits lie as far as importance. Those always are the top three. Reliability is the easiest tangible benefit to talk to consumers about, and that is one that they claim of high importance. And a lot of our research does the exact economic value to consumers, the money savings as far as with programs that they are offered, such as time-based rates or demand response programs. And then we also have an environmental benefit side that talks about less truck rolls, less outages, less CO2 emissions. So there is some heartstrings you can touch with consumers and get them to be interested in the benefits and interested in kind of showing that their utility is acting in their best interest. It's something that a lot of consumers have had a hard time believing that their utility acts in their best interest. They trust their utility, but they don't believe it works in their best interest. But showing the benefits to them and creating some custom messaging around those benefits helps them to realize that it's not just for the utility's benefit. These benefits directly are passed on to them. So I think that there's a lot of good tie-ins there that we can make, and it's more around the education side.
So, you look like you have a comment.
Yeah, I would, just to weigh in on this one, because I think a lot of what has been said is valuable, and I agree, particularly with the importance of automation. But, you know, a lot of what's happening in sort of the internet age and the, you know, fast fail type of thing is impacting the utility as well. So as most people know, we're typically under a regulatory model where, you know, you are extremely risk averse, and that is anathema. It's on the other contrary to a lot of the first principles of innovation. So, but I think that's changing, and it's certainly changing at ComEd. So to your question of how do you gauge success for these programs, success is not really when we try to figure out what to do or not to do. Are we going to have 4 million surefire, 98% no risk wins? No. That is not how we look at a problem anymore. Now we start asking ourselves, similar to what folks in this room and the industry are asking, what are the pilots that will drive customer value? How do we bring the stakeholders together so that people understand what we're experimenting with? Let's be honest and candid about what the learnings are in advance as we frame these pilots out, and then let's try it. And then figure out on some smaller scale how we expand the learnings. So for example, in terms of concrete things we're doing at ComEd, I told you earlier we're working on each of the 3 networks. So on the physical network, you've heard about microgrids. You're going to hear about them even more if you go to Shay Baramarad's panel tomorrow. On the digital grid, you heard Ann Pramajori talk about AMI water. Great example. We have an AMI network. And now we need to start thinking about, well, what else can ride or be used on that network? Maybe water technology, maybe gas technology, who knows? But we can't just do that and make sure that it's going to work or not. So we're pairing to do this pilot that we don't know right now whether it's 100% successful or not. All we know is that it has learnings that matter, and we're helping to shape the thoughts of, you know, other stakeholders in understanding the value of that. Data is another great example. So in terms of building out our digital network, we are working to implement Green Button Connect and building out that infrastructure, working internally to figure out what are the packets of data, whether it's anonymized data, whether it's certain intervals of data that reses and retail electric suppliers and other third parties want, so that we need to experiment with different tariff types. Is this the type of data you want? How are you going to use it? And customers, do you want to use the data this way through Green Button Connect or not? So we're experimenting. And on the social side, we're actually trying to work on an energy marketplace. Talk about something which when people first heard about it, they said, that sounds a little insane, Jane. I mean, do you honestly think people want to shop for products with their utility? And the answer is, probably not in every instance, but if you're going into your My Account space and in that moment you think you have an issue, with the level of insights and data analytics, et cetera, and you're on the web platform, can you connect the customer to the digital grid, to stuff that Ravi and others are doing by taking advantage of that moment? So that's a pilot that we're trying to work on internally as well, as are other utilities. There are a handful of other utilities working on energy marketplaces, and that's going to be interesting as well. So we don't gauge success by like 100% win. We gauge it by where's the value, what are the learnings, and let's figure out a pathway to get it done and get those learnings quickly.
Makes sense.
You know, just to riff on what Jane was saying, I mean, I think we live in interesting times, right? It's so much in flux. And I had the pleasure of sitting in on some of the New York Rev sessions. And what's interesting about that is the whole idea of a platform and a marketplace, right? That's core to this whole idea of building out a marketplace where you can have different services and products offered, where you can have more participants come in, all enabled really through a digital platform. But the idea of opening up this space to accommodate more through a marketplace is very powerful and compelling. And I think, hopefully, you know, I think New York Rev is early enough. Who knows how it's going to pan out? But I think, again, back to Jane's point, you don't know it till you try it. And they're certainly going the whole hog for it, and hopefully something will come of it that will, in the end, wind up benefiting consumers in the end. Right?
And so we know consumers are going to give up some of their personal information as they're participating in these programs, and particularly the data streams that are available to offer up those relevant solutions. So one question along those lines on marketplace dynamics, what makes it worth it to them? What do you need to offer consumers to get them to give up that information? Open to anybody who cares an opinion.
No, I like very much the analogy to the OnStar stuff, right? When it's passive in many ways, but you recognize the gains, I think that people are willing or not as conscious of the fact that they're giving up some information. I mean, the flip side to that is from a technology viewpoint and the fact that we're employing all this technology to pass this data around. First and foremost is how do you secure that data? Number one, so that nobody else gets it. Number two, so that privacy is maintained. Mm-hmm. So those are issues that we will have to have going in. It's not an afterthought. It's something that you start out with right away. But I think I lost what your question was. So I'll let you pass it on.
Well, Claire, I'm wondering if you have any perspectives on this. I mean, I know your organization funds a lot of different types of programs. Mm-hmm. Any insights on what you see work really well in those lines?
Well, I think on the privacy question, initially there was a pushback on smart meters in some tiny pockets around the Chicago area, and nobody knew how big that was going to get when the installation started, and it didn't get very big. And there were some people who raised some initial privacy concerns, like somebody can watch my meter data and know that I'm home. And the response to that is somebody can watch your house and know that you're home. And it's much more effective to just watch your house if the goal is to break into it. So it's just not a good burglary strategy. And but
that's another panel.
And I think, and I've spent a lot of time thinking of what good burglary strategies are. But I think people will give up privacy when they get something back for it, and we do it all the time with our Google searches and our Facebook postings, and our whole lives are out there somewhere because we felt we got something back for that. And we don't know yet, really, what customers are willing to give up that data stream to get back because there aren't enough applications available. We're about to find out. But from what we can see in the early reactions from just not even particularly low income or elderly customers, but just regular middle class customers, if there's an ability for a little bit of advance warning that something's going wrong in your house, that's worth giving up some privacy for. Mm-hmm. And I think what those other things will be, somebody's going to have to figure them out. But there is a willingness there to let that data go to somebody if a benefit comes back.
Yeah, Claire, building on that point, I think that there's actually another explosion of data that's coming into some connected homes. So I don't even have the answer or even the sense of how that, but it seems to me that as we're seeing more of the embedded computing, the same way that cars suddenly had little microprocessors put in the wheels and the engine and all parts of the car, that's happening in the home. So the question is there some, if we talk about networks and networks, there's clearly an overlap. If a home can be made to operate more efficiently in the same way that a car operated more efficiently, which then advanced bigger societal goals of more fuel efficient cars that lasted longer, better value for consumers. If homes are suddenly having this explosion of data, which is in process with connected homes, where is the linkage with what utilities are trying to achieve and do? And so where can you have that point of connection? I don't know the answer to that, but there is some mutual advantage conceptually to be achieved by that, and it's in process right now.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I was going to add to this, and it's interesting because this bleeds into a little bit of the panel for tomorrow, so I'll do the test run on it. What will customers give up? Well, what do they want in order to give up some of their privacy? And I'm going to pull it up a level. Up to now, what utilities have tried to frame the value prop as is system-wide. So we've tried to go out there and say, you have SAFE, you have CAIDI, you have average duration, system-wide reliability. And does that move customers to give up that little piece of that privacy in order to hand that over? I think what we're realizing within ComEd, thanks to a lot of research from SGCC and also from just tons of customer focus groups and other customer focus research, is people don't care about, and they don't barely understand, no matter how many times you tell them what Safety and Katie are. They care about my energy, and they are willing to trade us something in order for more input about me. So my personalized reliability, I don't care about work happening in northern Illinois. What are you doing in my street in the coming quarter? And what product is good for my home based on my profile, usage profile for that day? This is the kind of feedback we're getting from our customers. That's the currency at which people are willing to move, and it's starting to permeate things that we're building within ComEd, from the personalized reliability reports, which are not system-wide. They are you, Stacy. This is what your household did in terms of reliability. So, you know, it is, I think, different, and what I'd like to start talking about, maybe tomorrow, is something that gently challenged what you were sort of touching on, Brewster, because lots of people have brought up this, customers only want to think about their energy 7 minutes in a year. And that's really true. That's almost like a truism out there. But I'm starting to wonder, and I don't know the answer, is that right? 15, 20 years ago, I never thought about where my food came from. I never thought about whether it was organic, and farm to table meant nothing to me. Today, I am much more conscious about my food, where it's grown, how it's cared for, whether it's organic. I think that's a good thing. Other people may disagree. So I agree with you that the truism is 7 minutes. That's all people want to think about their electricity, but I don't know. Maybe that's changing, and maybe that's positive.
Yeah, what's happening with solar and then a little bit with batteries is a perfect example, Jane, of what you're saying.
Yeah.
There's been an organization at Wayne State University has been doing work on an algorithm that does analysis of the ISO data and gets the incremental carbon impact of a slight addition to the peak use, so that you know that your house by your transformer triggers the dispatch of that last dirty coal plant if you crank the AC up right now. We don't know yet how customers are going to react to that kind of data, but I'm going to guess there's a segment of the customer population that cares about that a lot.
Yes, I mean, I have one personal reaction to that. You know, I signed up for my utility for online account notification, right? And suddenly, sometime last year, I started getting paper statements. And why did I suddenly start getting this? I opened it up, and the only thing that it had in there was the chart of my usage versus the most efficient neighbor and the least efficient neighbor. And I guess it's trying to manage me in some way, right? And I take that for what it is. And of course, that's not the only use for it, but in terms of using data and analytics to figure out and try and modify behavior to the utility's benefit, if you like, or even to the larger societal benefit, right? In Minneapolis, for example, now switching topics to your point about where does your energy come from? I mean, for the longest time we've had, I think 20 years ago you paid an extra $10 to ensure that you got, wind power, right? Because I'm sure they put a tag on each of those electrons. But more recently now, of course, there's a big push to community solar and things like that. And there are people who care about it. I mean, I care about it, so I do make the extra effort to go out and find those. But the other side to that is it's not just a purely societal benefit, as I certainly see it, but it's also supposed to reflect in some savings for me, right? And in the end, I mean, I do care about how much I save, and I think that's true for the broader audience too.
Makes sense. What questions do you guys have in the audience? Yes, sir.
Probably a fairly basic question, but I, listening to all you guys, and I heard some of the panels talk about a lot of the solutions need to come to the private sector. I think from the private sector, it might have been Ann that said that, I'm not sure. And Austin Energy, for example, if you're willing to let them control your appliances or your air conditioner, they'll save you some money, right? That's a use case, a very basic use case. How, in a regulatory environment, though, if you're thinking about the private sector needs to come in and they'll spur some innovation, probably a lot of things you're talking about can get solved by the private sector coming in and providing innovation.
like 10 tough questions, and then I'm not sure I
your
can.
favorite.
But I'll make this brief because I want to punt this over to my colleagues on to the left. So in terms of, these are questions that we're grappling with. I do think there is a way, you're touching also on sort of the utility control question, right? So at the end of the day, there are pieces like, for example, AMI Water, the work that we're doing. It is a network that is built with customer ratepayer, basically contributions, for example. And all uses of the network, you've got to start doing just the math and start thinking, what's the allocation of costs? And is there an area or a band where third parties might end up contributing to that by way of a fee, for example? That revenue would presumably go back to customers to decrease what we would typically call our revenue requirement. I'm not saying that is the model. I'm saying that there are lots of different conversations like that that are happening across the country for people to understand how third parties, whether you're coming in to get data, whether you're coming in to get, plug into the network or the platform at a certain place, what is the contribution back to the system? The question you're talking about, that I think Ann was asked this question as well, about sort of controlling the infrastructure, that's a tough one. Because I don't think utilities would say, for example, we build all the microgrids, not at all. But at some point around critical infrastructures, like O'Hare International Airport, for example, you have to make a call. Do you really want 10 different privatized air traffic controllers? I mean, there are some functions, and this is the conversation we have to have about public-private, sort of that public purpose, some functions where you are going to optimally have a central traffic cop or a central systems operator, particularly if you think the power flows on the system are going to becoming more complex and nuanced. I don't really think you want 10 different people calling it, because that complexity adds to the potential for error. And it's not answered. This has to be part of the conversation, and I think we welcome it.
Other thoughts? All right, we had one here and then right over there.
A lot of conversations have been focused on whether it's single-family homes or from the perspective of low-income consumers. I would assume that from an 80-20 rule, the C&I loads within utilities are probably 80% of the actual load. If some of the panels can speak about the C&I market, why are regulators not attacking that market first? Because that is where the most single largest impact in terms of customer education, in terms of, you can make a lot of bang for your buck there. If the panels can discuss about that customer profile, I think I'd appreciate that.
Well, so, yeah, let's take that, because that's a fascinating, that's a really good question. So you look at a total system demand, large C&I, let's take the case of Texas, is going to be the bulk of power. However, it's a pretty flat load. And also, it is where the regulators in Texas, as an example, have gone first, so that on summer peak demand, they go to the big power plants and refineries, and they have well-established programs. Those companies pay a lower rate, and they get called on first during peak demand events. So you have large C&I. That market is already pretty well in place in many areas of the world, industrialized areas of the world, and it's a flat load. It's not nearly as peaky as residential and small C&I. And then you have residential, and if you can figure out a solution that works on residential, boom, you've got it. The consumers have within a set of bounds a pretty predictable common set of behaviors at play. Then you get to the other part of the market, which is that small to medium-sized C&I, and man, it is a total kaleidoscope. How many different uses, we've done C&I work as well. How many different things can a 5,000 square foot space be used for in a commercial? I mean, it can be a dry cleaner, it can be a post office, like a UPS store, it can be a restaurant, and man, they are all over the map. And so it is very difficult to develop a utility program that operates at any kind of predictable, broad scale on mid to small C&I because of the total diversity of uses in small C&I. Not to mention you have split incentives where they don't own the building many times, they pay rent, and they pay the utility bills, but they don't control the building themselves. So that small to medium C&I has some very significant barriers. And the last thing I'll tell you, at least like in Texas, is we figured out with ERCOT that about 70% of demand, of peak demand in the summer is residential, And of that, from our research, we found about 85% of that is residential air conditioning. So you're talking, somewhere in the neighborhood of Texas, for example, of about 60% of peak demand is residential air conditioning. That's the old Willie Loman line. He robbed the bank, that's where the money is. That's where the action is in peak demand management.
We had a question right here, and then we have time for, I think, one additional question after that. Go
I was
ahead.
just curious about the renewable part. What do the consumers really value in terms of that conversation? Is it that they're lowering greenhouse and saving the world, or is there some other more public shaming part to it that are kind of keeping us a little bit more honest about ourselves?
Like putting the pictures of the people who violate the tolls in the paper.
What are the consumers really saying? And it may differ by demographic too. So I'm
Thoughts?
just curious.
Yeah,
About renewable.
we actually, when we ask questions around consumers' interest in connecting renewables to the grid, they rate that really high. So they are very interested in that, and we kind of go a little bit deeper dive and ask them why. And it does change based on demographics. So we have a segmentation framework that we use, and it's usually, we have green champions, they're called, under age 35, higher income, college educated, place the most value on renewable energy resources. And I do think it is a little bit of a what's popular with society motivation more than necessarily an individual feeling that they need to give back to the environment. Based on the questions they answer, you can kind of pull some implications out that it is a little bit based on what is more trending right now. But there also is a strong interest in creating their own energy as far as being, wanting to invest in community solar or residential solar. There's a lot of interest in quote unquote going off the grid. So we do a lot of educational materials around the importance of the grid and how actually connecting all these distributed energy resources to the grid makes it more of a need to have an advanced grid. So kind of myth busting around that, because there's a lot of feeling that they'll be self-sustaining and with Tesla's Powerwall, and they'll be able to have all these things and they'll be totally on their own. So between those two motivations, I think that kind of is where consumers are at as far as connecting renewables to the grid.
Yeah, Nathan, I'm going to build that because we've done a lot of work in this area too, measuring what they do and what they say, right? And so interestingly, on the case of rooftop solar panels, this is, first of all, we have to remember the consumer market does not act like any other market. Consumers not being counted. There is no ROI on leather upholstery in a car. There is, the ROI on wood windows is really poor, but those are considered nice. And consumers buy things as a general matter. There are some very cost-conscious customers. They don't tend to lead the markets, however, right? Markets are built by early adopters, and then the rest of the market tends to come along later on. And so what's going on with solar, which is very fascinating at the moment, is you have a mix of people that are technology early adopters, but also this is in the same sense of leather upholstery and wood windows and granite countertops. This makes me feel good. It makes me feel good for a variety of reasons, more control, whatever. But a bigger meta narrative is emerging, which is, I think, something we all should pay attention to, which is this is coming wrapped up potentially in what is involved in a nice home. We know a nice home is a nice home. We know how it's a nice home because it has granite countertops. It has hardwood floors, right? Which it has wood windows. So we are seeing solar panels in particular emerge in that mix of stuff that is defined as the high-end home or the aspirational home. And it is completely devoid of the money savings. It is completely devoid of anything other than I want to feel like I have a nice home. And that seems real super amorphous, and it drives people that have to measure the cost and benefit return of this nuts, and it should. But customers don't act like that, right? And so I think we have to understand that that's what's going on with solar. It seems to be how batteries are playing in it. Batteries. Remember also, the last thing I say on this is, why do people buy gas generators for home, right? Because once every 4 years, maybe every 8 years, their home will be without power, and then they can still have cold wine, right? And
It's my priority.
yeah, right. My parents have one, right? And so a battery is is fitting in that same security bucket. There is no return on investment of battery, but if a battery can be positioned, particularly integrated with solar panels, where it meets that security need, then suddenly they've entered the market of no return on investment required. It's a security sale, the same way that a burglar alarm is a security sale. So you've got a lot of these things, but the core at your question is the consumer market acts differently from everyone else.
Well, it sounds like we're talking a little bit about the difference between ROI and cost benefit and identity. You know, if you think about, it gets a little, I think, to what maybe Jane was saying about we didn't used to identify ourselves as the way we consume food, but now there's an identity around that we might be seeing that in our energy consumption as well as a population. Well, thank you guys for your questions. I thought we'd have time for one more, but we had great answers, and I want to give our panelists one last word each before we close on time, and I'm hoping they can stay a few minutes after. If you guys have individual questions, maybe we can field those. So I'm just going to go down the line if that's okay. Parting thoughts.
My one parting thought, and it's a riff off of what Brewster was saying. I've said this before. I love technology. Technology can be both a divide as well as a bridge. I struggle when we talk about technology and pair it up with the Bosch-filled home and the Thermador and the beautiful, 3-car garage. As a utility, we have a deep commitment to making sure that all of our customers have access to this type of stuff. It's not negotiable. And so I think it is constantly important to challenge ourselves as a community and to challenge our utilities. And Claire's very good at making sure we're challenged, that we have a vibrant low-income strategy, that we stop thinking that technology is only for these people who live in Winnetkas and Kenilworths, and that individuals in a different socioeconomic group, they only care about keeping their bill low. That is a recipe for creating a tech divide. And it's one that I think we are very conscious about trying to avoid creating. So that is my parting thought. Over to you. Oh, and I get applause.
I'll just add to that what we see in the work that we're funding is that people actually are pretty smart about knowing what their own needs are. And so as we're trying to figure out this marketplace, we should be asking them.
My parting thought is kind of to echo a little bit of what Jane said earlier on individualized messaging and not trying to talk to consumers about the total benefit because, like she said, they really don't care that much. They want to see what directly will affect them in their house. So segmenting consumers, knowing exactly what they want to hear from and what products and services can be sold to them is the key to getting them to be more engaged and maybe think about it more than the Accenture study of 7 minutes a year. So kind of moving beyond that by doing the segmented and customized messaging for each type of consumer.
Siemens, we're known as a big engineering company, but there's something that's happened that's really reflected by everybody on this panel because it's such a diverse view, is that it's going away from this reliability-centric, grid-centric, engineering-centric grid to a much more consumer-focused, much more microtransactive-based grid. And that's what the future's going to be.
We've begun doing a lot of work on consumer water research, and in general, the state of metering and data in the water utility world is probably half a decade to a decade behind where it is in electric, and they have battery-powered meters in underground pits, so they have huge problems. But they actually have an area where they've been at something a lot longer than the electric side, and that is on kind of consumer education and consumer engagement. And what they will tell you is that customers hate being judged. So much so that when you hear this stuff about let's do public shaming, which is a big part of the conversation, the really progressive water utilities moved away from that years ago because their customers hate it. People actually won't even open things that have bad news attached to them, and they won't listen to it. So if you're trying to do a message of public shaming, the water utilities guys can tell you from a couple of decades of experience, your customers will disengage and not listen to you if you do that.
Good to know. My parting thought is to thank you all for your attention and to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for their great presentation.